Good morning and welcome to This Week.
There is no middle ground.
This morning, a This Week exclusive, former Vice President Dick Cheney, the administration's harshest critic.
The president's been largely silent.
Half measures keep you half exposed.
The White House must stop dithering.
With no apologies of his own.
I was and remain a strong proponent of our enhanced interrogation program.
National security, Iran, politics, and
Iraq, I think it's going to be one of the great achievements of this administration.
Dick Cheney takes on the current vice president only on This Week. Then, a Washington thaw.
I'm going to spend some time listening.
But can bipartisanship survive the politics of the moment?
We need a commander-in-chief, not a professor of law standing at the lectern.
That and the rest of the week's politics on our roundtable with George Will, Peter Beinart of the Council on Foreign Relations, the New Yorker's Jane Mayer, and Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal. And as always, the Sunday Funnies.
John McCain knew that it was Sarah Palin's birthday, and he did something very nice for her. He bought her a Toyota.
From the heart of the nation's capital, This Week, with ABC's congressional correspondent Jonathan Karl, live from the Newseum on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Joining me now, former Vice President Dick Cheney. Mr. Vice President, welcome to This Week.
Oh, good morning, John.
Now, you have been unflinching in your criticism of this administration's handling of terrorism, counterterrorism. Most recently, talking about the Christmas Day bomber, you said, "It is clear once again that President Obama is trying to pretend that we are not at war." Now, this morning, we have heard from the current Vice President, Joe Biden, directly in response to that.
We're pursuing that war with a vigor like it's never been seen before. We've eliminated 12 of their top 20 people. We have taken out 100 of their associates. We've sent them underground. They are, in fact, not able to do anything remotely like they were in the past. They are on the run. I don't know where Dick Cheney has been.
Your response?
Well, my reference to the notion that the president was trying to avoid treating this as a war was in relation to his initial response when we heard about the Christmas underwear bomber up in Detroit, when he went out and said this was the act of an isolated extremist. No, it wasn't. And we found out over time, obviously, and he eventually changed his assessment, but that in fact this was an individual who'd been trained by Al-Qaeda, who'd been part of a larger conspiracy, and it was closer to being an act of war than it was the act of an isolated extremist. It's the mindset that concerns me, John. I think it's very important to go back and keep in mind the distinction between handling these events as criminal acts, which is the way we did before 9/11, and then looking at 9/11 and saying this is not a criminal act, not when you destroy 16 acres of Manhattan, kill 3,000 Americans, blow a big hole in the Pentagon. That's an act of war. What the administration was slow to do was to come to that recognition that we are at war, not dealing with criminal acts. And as I say, my response there dealt specifically with the fact the president called it an isolated extremist. It was not.
Well, I want to get to that notion of treating this as a law enforcement action, but what the administration will say is look at what they have done, 30,000 additional troops to Afghanistan, doubling, tripling, or maybe even more the drone attacks on the tribal areas in Pakistan on Al-Qaeda targets. They say that they are actually dedicating more resources to the fight against Al-Qaeda than you were.
Well, I'm a complete supporter of what they're doing in Afghanistan. I think the president made the right decision to send troops into Afghanistan. I thought it took him a while to get there. Having Stan McChrystal now in charge in Afghanistan, I think is an excellent choice. General McChrystal's one of the most able officers I know. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing in Afghanistan. I'm not a critic of what they're doing in terms of how they're dealing with that situation. But I do see repeatedly examples that there are key members in the administration, like Eric Holder, for example, the Attorney General, who still insist on thinking of terror attacks against the United States as criminal acts as opposed to acts of war, and that's a huge distinction.
Okay, before we get to Eric Holder, a couple more things from the Vice President. He's been out responding preemptively to you. One thing that he said, we heard in the open, that he believes Iraq may ultimately prove to be one of the greatest achievements of the Obama administration.
Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by my friend Joe Biden. I'm glad he now believes Iraq is a success. Of course, Biden and Obama and Biden campaigned from one end of the country to the other for 2 years, criticizing our Iraq policy. They opposed the surge that was absolutely crucial to our getting to the point we're at now with respect to Iraq. For them to try to take credit for what's happened in Iraq strikes me as a little strange. I think if they had had their way, if we'd followed the policies they pursued from the outset or advocated from the outset, Saddam Hussein would still be in power in Baghdad today. So if they're going to take credit for it, fair enough for what they've done while they're there, but it ought to go with a healthy dose of thank you, George Bush, up front, and a recognition that some of their early recommendations with respect to prosecuting that war were just dead wrong.
Well, in fact, Vice President Biden says that he believes that the war in Iraq was not worth it. What do you say to that? I mean, given the resources that were drawn away from the what you could argue is the Central Front in Afghanistan, Pakistan, is he right about that?
No. I believe very deeply in the proposition that what we did in Iraq was the right thing to do. It was hard to do. It took a long time. There were significant costs involved. But we got rid of one of the worst dictators of the 20th century. We took down his government, a man who produced and used weapons of mass destruction, a man who'd started 2 different wars, a man who had a relationship with terror. We're going to have a democracy in Iraq today. We do today. They're going to have another free election this March. This has been an enormous achievement from the standpoint of peace and stability in the Middle East and ending a threat to the United States. As I say, Joe Biden doesn't believe that. Joe Biden wants to take credit, I'm not sure for what, since he opposed that policy pretty much from the outset.
I think what he wants to take credit for is taking resources out of Iraq. The fact
that's being done in accordance with the timetable that we initiated, that we negotiated with the Iraqis. I mean, that was our policy.
Another thing from the Vice President, he also addressed the possibility of another 9/11 style attack.
The idea of there being a massive attack in the United States like 9/11 is unlikely, in my view. But if you see what's happening, particularly with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they have decided to move in a direction of much more small bore but devastatingly frightening attacks.
Is he right?
I don't think so. And I would point to a study that was released just within the last week or two up at the Kennedy School at Harvard by a gentleman, Moffat Larson's his name, I believe, who was CIA for 23 years, director of intelligence at the Energy Department for a long time, that looks at this whole question of weapons of mass destruction and Al-Qaeda, and comes to the conclusion that there's a very high threat that Al-Qaeda is trying very hard to acquire a weapon of mass destruction, and if they're successful in acquiring it, that they will use it. I think he's right. I think, in fact, the situation with respect to Al-Qaeda to say that, that was a big attack we had on 9/11, but it's not likely again, I just think that's dead wrong. I think the biggest strategic threat the United States faces today is the possibility of another 9/11 with a nuclear weapon or a biological agent of some kind. And I think Al-Qaeda is out there, even as we meet, trying to figure out how to do that.
And do you think that the Obama administration is taking the necessary steps to prevent that?
I think they need to do everything they can to prevent it. And if the mindset is it's not likely, then it's difficult to mobilize the resources and get people to give it the kind of priority that it deserves.